Got it. Okay, cool. So again, I'm Justin. I'm going to be presenting on Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels, who's pictured there on the right. So context. First, I think it's important to start with some context about the work to situate it in the period that Engels wrote it in. It was originally written in the late 1870s by Engels as part of a much larger work. I have the German title there, although I'm not going to try to pronounce that. In English, it's Düring's Revolution in Science, or commonly referred to as Anti-Düring for short. So it was taken out of that larger form book, which was originally published in serials, so in different parts, and it was turned into a pamphlet into French by Paul Lafargue, who's actually Marx's son-in-law. And it saw a great deal of success in French in France before being released in a German edition, English edition, and a bunch of other languages. The pamphlet had a huge impact on the early development of Marxism and Marxist thought, with Engels even saying, "I'm not aware that any other socialist work, not even our Communist Manifesto of 1848 or Marx's Capital, has been so often translated," which just shows the popularity it received and the influence that it had. And as we'll see throughout, there are more than a few really famous and notorious phrases and terms that Engels uses here, which we see throughout Marxist literature from this point on. And one important point of discussion that I want to raise is the title of the pamphlet, which is specifically the utopian and scientific part. So utopian here isn't just referring to the idea of we need to make society better, right? We need to live in a better society, or else Marx, Engels, most communists, us, would be utopians as well, right? Like we all want to make society better. We're going to hear what Engels has to say about the three great utopians, and he'll elaborate on utopian socialism there. But in general, it's usually used to refer to socialists whose idea of socialism was grounded in various abstract notions of equality without a clear class definition or a clear class motive. And the actual term scientific socialism wasn't first coined by Engels or Marx. And William Clare Roberts, in the great book Marx's Inferno, credits Proudhon with coining the term scientific socialism in the quote, "The sovereignty of the will gives way to the sovereignty of reason and ends up being replaced by a scientific socialism." And he also says that Proudhon's notion of scientific socialism here was heavily indebted to Charles Fourier and his ideas of stages of history, which we're going to get into more later. And then also, just on another point, it was actually Engels' 201st birthday on Sunday, the 28th of November, I think. So yeah, it's fitting that we're covering this now. Okay, so there are 4 prefaces available to the book. There's an 1880 introduction to the first edition, which is in French, and it's written by Marx. Reading it, I think it refers to Marx in the third person, but I think that's because he sent it in a letter to Lafargue, and Lafargue published it as if he had written it. There's an 1882 preface to the first German edition, and then there are 2 English prefaces, one the general introduction and one the history of the English middle class. I'm not going to go into every single one of them in depth, but in the French edition, we get a short biography to Engels listing some of his previous works, including the Communist Manifesto, and then also just talking about his work organizing in Brussels with the Communist League and other things that he's written. And then at the end, Marx gives a really good short synopsis of what the pamphlet is about. And he says, "The series of final articles which contributed to the Vorwärts under the ironic title of Herr Düring's Revolution in Science, in response to the allegedly new theories of Mr. Düring on science in general and socialism in particular, were assembled in one volume and were a great success among German socialists. In the present pamphlet, we reproduce the most topical excerpt from the theoretical section of the book, which constitutes what might be termed an introduction to scientific socialism." And then in the 1892 English introduction, we also get a really good description of Düring and what he had published specifically to get Engels to respond so emphatically. About 1875, Dr. Düring, a lecturer at Berlin University, suddenly and rather clamorously announced his conversion to socialism and presented the German public not only with an elaborate socialist theory, but also with a complete practical plan for the reorganization of society. So then he goes on to specifically point out that Düring formulated nothing less than a complete system of philosophy, mental, moral, natural, and historical, a complete system of political economy and socialism, and finally, a critical history of political economy. 3 big volumes in octavo, heavily extrinsically and intrinsically, 3 army corps of arguments mobilized against all previous philosophers and economists in general, and against Marx in particular. So Engels then also describes the growing power of the Socialist Party in Germany at the time, which was recently unified at the Gotha Unification Congress, and how, with Düring's conversion to socialism and with this book trying to espouse like a worldview that Düring agreed to, Engels felt that it was important to respond to it in the aims of not getting the party to split as Düring was forming kind of a sect around him. And this also helps us understand why Marx called it kind of an ironic title in Düring's Revolution in Science. And then for the last 2 prefaces, the general introduction and the history of materialism and the history of the English middle class, I don't think I'm going to cover those just because this pamphlet already covers like a huge scope of things. So I probably won't have time to, but I really do recommend that after reading the pamphlet itself, to go back and read the last preface, especially History of the English Middle Class, because I think it's a great example of Engels applying the method of historical materialism to the English class. And I think specifically it's on the role of religion in the English middle class. So in the first part of the pamphlet, it's entitled Utopian Socialism. So Engels pays homage to, and he recounts a partial history of some of the most influential utopian socialists. And there have been a lot of works in like the past 100 years, 150 years, trying to reflect on the amount of influence these early socialists had on the works of Marx. One, again, being the book that I brought up earlier, Marx's Inferno by William Clare Roberts, where he heavily ties the ideas of Robert Owen to Marx and argues that there's a clear continuity there. But in this section, Engels is talking about the theoretical basis that these 3 utopians in particular had in common with each other. So first he starts out on the difference between modern or scientific socialism and that of the utopians. And he says, in its theoretical form, modern socialism or scientific socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had at first to connect itself with the intellectual stock and trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in material economic facts. So he's framing modern scientific socialism as an extension of utopian socialism, as utopian socialism plus the advancements of adding something else. So the question is, what is that new addition? What was added on top of utopian socialism in order to bring us to scientific socialism? And he doesn't answer that right away, but we will get to that. So he starts describing how in the 18th century, as the fledgling proletariat started to develop, demands for equality were no longer limited to political rights, such as bourgeois democracy, like you saw at the end of the feudal period with voting rights, etc. But they also began to extend to social conditions. And he says it was not simply class privileges that were abolished, but class distinctions themselves. And he introduces 3 examples of utopians who wanted to abolish those class distinctions. And those are Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. And after naming them, he gives us a hint to what the answer of our earlier question was and what separates modern scientific socialism from utopian socialism. And he says, one thing is common to all 3. Not one of them appears as a representative of that proletariat which historical development had, in the meantime, produced. Like the French philosophers of the 18th century, they do not claim to emancipate a particular class to begin with, but all humanity at once. Like them, they wish to bring in the kingdom of reason and eternal justice. But this kingdom, as they see it, is as far as heaven from earth, from that of the French philosophers. For, to our three social reformers, the bourgeois world, based upon the principles of these philosophers, is quite as irrational and unjust, and therefore finds its way to the dust hole quite as readily as feudalism and all the earlier stages of society. If pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius, who has now arisen and who now understands truth. That he has now arisen, that the truth has now been clearly understood, is not an inevitable event, following of necessity in the chains of historical development, but a mere happy accident. He might just as well have been born 500 years earlier, and then might have spared humanity 500 years of error, strife, and suffering. So Engels here is drawing a picture of what the utopians lacked, right? None of them appeared as a representative of a class. None of them appeared as a representative of the proletariat. And none of them believed that the driving force leading us to socialism would be the class antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Instead, like the French philosophers who helped us usher in the bourgeois world from the feudal, they believed that reason and justice were going to bring us to a world of social reform, a world with no class distinction, a world of socialism, a world of communism. The only reason we haven't gotten there yet, and the only reason that this hasn't happened, is that we've been wrong, we haven't understood reason, we haven't understood justice, because ultimately reason and justice will lead us there. So this implies that, on the contrary, right, modern scientific socialism understands the importance of the role of the proletariat. Lars Lee wrote a really great book called Lenin Rediscovered that I really recommend to anyone that wants to or does call themselves a Leninist. Refers to this as the merger formula. And he says that merger is the merger between socialism and the worker movement. And this is evident in the Communist Manifesto, in Kautsky's The Erfurt Program, and in Lenin's conception of the Vanguard Party. And it's the idea that, in Marx's words, the immediate aim of the communists is formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of bourgeois rule, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. So scientific socialism's task is not only to explain at a rhetorical level the proletariat's calling to taking political power, but to engage in propaganda and agitation towards that end. And then Kautsky also does a really good job of explaining this merger and also how it differs from the utopian way of thinking. And this is also in the Erfurt program, which I mentioned earlier. In order for the socialists and the worker movements to become reconciled and to become fused into a single movement, socialism and the worker movements, in order to become fused into a single movement, socialism had to break out of the utopian way of thinking. This was the world historical deed of Marx and Engels. In the Communist Manifesto of 1847, they laid the scientific foundations of a new modern socialism, or as we say today, of social democracy. By so doing, they gave socialism solidity and turned what had hitherto been a beautiful dream of well-meaning enthusiasts into an earnest object of struggle, and showed this to be the necessary consequence of economic development. To the fighting proletariat, they gave a clear awareness of its historical task, and they placed it in a condition to speed to its great goal as quickly and with as few sacrifices as possible. The socialists no longer have the task of freely inventing a new society, but rather of uncovering its existing elements in existing society. No more do they have to bring salvation from its misery to the proletariat from above, but rather they have to support its class struggle through increasing its insight and promoting its economic and political organizations, and in doing so, bring about as quickly and as painlessly as possible the day when the proletariat will be able to save itself. The task of social democracy is to make the class struggle of the proletariat aware of its aim and capable of choosing the best means to attain this aim. So we're going to see examples of what Kautsky's talking about there, of model experiments and from above in what the utopians do. But I really don't want this to be pictured as the utopians were like naive or stupid, and that's why they didn't believe in class struggle or believe in the proletariat. I think that Marx and Engels definitely paid them a lot of respects in their works, although they do ruthlessly criticize them at points. We're going to talk later in the section on historical materialism on the impact of existing economic conditions on ideas. But Engels has a quote where he's explaining like why the utopians believed in achieving social reform, communism in this way. And he says, the historical situation also dominated the founders of socialism. To the crude conditions of capitalistic production and crude class conditions correspond crude theories. The solution of the social problems, which as yet lay hidden in undeveloped economic conditions, the utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. To remove these was the task of reason. It was necessary then to discover a new, more perfect system of social order and to oppose this upon society from without by propaganda, and wherever it was necessary, by the example of model experiments. These new social systems were foredoomed as utopian. The more completely they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasies. All right, so now we're going to talk about the actual utopians themselves. And first up is Henri de Seinen, who I have a photograph of, or a drawing, I guess, of there. And in reading about these utopian socialists, I also really recommend the book, The Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbronner, I think. He covers all three of them in very good detail. And overall, it's just a really good book on like the history of economic thought, although just don't read the chapter on Marx because that's really bad. Okay, but Engels describes Saint-Simon as a son of the French Revolution, at the outbreak of which he was not yet 30. And speaking of revolutions, actually, Saint-Simon fought in the American Revolutionary War, which I thought was really interesting. But Engels also mentions that Saint-Simon saw the antagonism in French society as one between workers and idlers, where idlers were any who didn't take part in either production or distribution. So we arrive at a situation where, you know, manufacturers, so like factory owners, merchants, and bankers were put together in the workers bucket along with traditional wage workers or wage laborers. And then anyone else who just lived on an income but didn't contribute was an idler. So from that, Saint-Simon decided that society should be led by science and industry, both united by a new religious bond, destined to restore that unity of religious ideas which had been lost since the time of the Reformation. And one really interesting thing that Engels brings up in this section, and Engels gives him credit for, is the start of a discovery, like the embryo of thought. And he says, the knowledge that economic conditions are the basis of political institutions appear here only in embryo. Yet what is already very plainly expressed is the idea of the future conversion of political rule over men into an administration of things and a direction of processes of production. That is to say, the abolition of the state, about which recently there has been so much noise. So we're gonna come back to the idea of the abolition of the state. But one of the most, I think what is the most famous line from this pamphlet is exactly on that topic, and it comes up later. So the second utopian is Charles Fourier, or Fourier. And again, there's a drawing of him there. I think that Engels sums him up quite well by saying, if in Saint-Simon we find a comprehensive breadth of view, by virtue of which almost all of the ideas of later socialists that are not strictly economic are found in him in embryo, we find in Fourier a criticism of the existing conditions of society. Genuinely French and witty, but not upon that account any of the less thorough. So Engels also credits Fourier with criticizing the moral misery of bourgeois society, usually through a lot of satire and lots of wit. He credits him with criticizing the bourgeois form of relations between the sexes, and also just the general position of women in bourgeois society. I think the point where he definitely like heaps the most praise on him is when he's discussing his conception of history of society, or the history of society, where Fourier describes how Engels says, civilization moves in a vicious circle, in contradictions which it constantly reproduces without being able to solve them. Hence, it constantly arrived at the very opposite of that which it wants to attain, or pretends to want to attain. So that, for example, under civilization, poverty is born out of superabundance itself, which I think is a very familiar description of even modern times. And Engels notes that here we can see the dialectic method at work, which we're going to discuss further in the second section after the Utopian Socialists. But he says that Fourier, in showing that each historical phase has its period of ascent and descent, is arguing against any idea of unchanging or human perfectibility without limit, which we often saw. So last but not least is Robert Owen, who I mentioned earlier. Robert Owen was a manufacturer, factory owner. He directed a cotton mill at New Lanark in Scotland. And in doing so, he set out to experiment. So Engels describes Owen as someone who had adopted the teaching of the materialistic philosophers, that man's character is the product, on one hand, of heredity, and on the other hand, of the environment of the individual during his lifetime, and especially during his period of development. So at New Lanark, which is where he had the mill, Owen essentially tried to create a model of socialism through this colony of workers. So Engels describes a population originally consisting of the most diverse and, for the most part, very demoralized elements, a population that gradually grew to 2,500, he turned into a model colony in which drunkenness, police, magistrates, lawsuits, poor laws, charity were unknown. And all this simply by placing the people in conditions worthy of human beings, and especially by carefully bringing up the rising generation. He was the founder of infant schools and introduced them first at New Lanark. At the age of 2, the children came to school where they enjoyed themselves so much that they could scarcely be got home again. Whilst his competitors worked their people 13 or 14 hours a day, in New Lanark, the working day was only 10.5 hours. When a crisis in cotton stopped work for 4 months, his workers received their full wages all the time. And with all this, the business more than doubled in value, and to the last yielded large profits to its proprietors. So even with all this, Owen looked at his workers and he still realized that they were essentially at his mercy. He called them literally slaves at my mercy. Because regardless of, the improved working conditions compared to other cotton mills, other factories in Scotland or around the world, they were still at his mercy. Like the relationship of wage labor was still there. So Owen realizes that these 2,500 people at New Lanark are producing as much wealth for society as it would take what Engels says is hundreds of thousands of people to create 50 to 100 years before. So then Owen started asking, where's that money going? Because it obviously wasn't going to the workers. And Engels says that Owen realizes it's going to the owners of these factories, to the investors that invested in these factories, either in the form of dividends that are paid out or in the forms of profit that are often reinvested to buy more machinery and to further capital accumulation. So Engels says, the newly created gigantic productive forces, hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, offered to Owen the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined, as the common property of all, to be worked for the common good of all. And this is essentially where Engels is portraying that Owen has realized, that these productive forces should be the common ownership of all. And he describes Owen's vision of communism as, he doesn't really describe it in detail. We don't get a great picture of what his vision is, but he does say that it's very business-like in that everything is very mathematical, and it's a plan that can just be followed to the strictest T. But what Engels does tell us is what happened to Owen once he realized that, in order to achieve these aims, this vision of common property of all, that he would have to tackle things like private property, religion, the existing form of bourgeois marriage. In doing those, in attacking those things, Engels says he knew what confronted him: excommunication from official society. And that's then exactly what Engels describes as happening to Owen. He was silenced in the press, he was banished from official society. He used to be like an extremely popular economist, and especially in wealthy circles, and from all of that, he was shunned. However, he did continue to fight on behalf of workers in England, and Engels gives a bunch of examples. I know that he helped force through laws on limiting the hours of labor that women and children could work, and he also served as president of the first Congress of Trade Unions of England. So with those very brief biographies, Engels closes the section on the utopians. And before closing, he gives one last remark that characterizes them all. To all of these, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as an absolute truth, is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man. It is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. With all this, absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school. And as each one's special kind of absolute truth, reason, and justice is again conditioned by his subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measure of his knowledge, and his intellectual training, there is no other ending possible in this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive of one another. Hence, from this nothing could come but a kind of eclectic average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to the present time dominated the minds of most of the socialist workers in France and England. And that's how Engels ends his section, the first section of the pamphlet on the Utopian Socialists. I'm going to take a drink of water, but are there any questions, any comments on that first section? No? Okay. Talking a lot. So the second section is on dialectics, which is a word that gets thrown out a lot in Marxist circles. So what is dialectics? Let's find out. On the right, we have a photo of Hegel, who we're going to talk about. People often, when talking about dialectics, they refer to either him, Aristotle, maybe. But in the chapter on dialectics, Engels starts out with a description of nature, which is very apt, I think, because one of what I think is probably his most contentious work is called The Dialectics of Nature. I often see a lot of very pointed opinions on it. But the quote is, "When we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations, in which nothing remains what, where, and as it was, but everything moves, changes, and comes into being and passes away. We see, therefore, at first the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combined, and are connected. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy, and was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus, that everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, is constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away." So I think in there, we can pull out in a good start of a definition of dialectics. And I really like the part that goes, a picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations. So I'm going to lean a little bit on Bertel Ollman, who is a very good philosopher and writer on Marx's method in Capital, namely dialectics, or the philosophy of internal relations. So in Dance of the Dialectic, which is one of my favorite books, Ullman says, "Dialectics restructures our thinking about reality by replacing the common sense notion of thing as something that may or may not undergo change, may or may not have relations with other things, with the notions of process, which contains its history and possible futures, and relation, which contains, as part of what it is, its ties with other relations. So what does that mean? Let's look at an example. We can look at how Marx abstracts capital. Okay, first he abstracts capital as a process. So in his definition of capital as a process, he's including primitive accumulation. He's including accumulation. He's including concentration of capital. So in sum, it's real history as part of what capital is. Then secondly, as abstracting it as a relation, he brings in its ties with labor, its ties with commodity, with value, capitalists, workers, anything else that contributes to its appearance and functioning, under the same rubric as its constituting aspects, rather than as separate things. So as Engels goes on to describe this thought process of things as relations and processes, dialectics, he contrasts it with metaphysical thinking. He says, none of these processes and modes of thought enter into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. So in that quote, we again see connection, concatenation can correspond to relations, and motion, origin, ending helps us think of it as a process. So after this, Engels goes back to nature, and he talks about how nature is the proof of dialectics, saying, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. So then, from that praise of Darwin, he also goes on to talking about, actual living beings and organisms, where he says, every organized being is every moment the same and not the same. Every moment it assimilates matter supplied from without and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed and is replaced by other molecules of matter, so that every organized being is always itself, and yet something other than itself. Further, we find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, for example, are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate. So, okay, repeatedly we're seeing these examples of how, through a metaphysical view, things that appear external to something can be seen as key parts of that thing when looked at through dialectics, through a philosophy of internal relations. And in this section, Engels is leaning heavily on nature. I think a lot of his examples keep going back to nature, whether that's plants, organisms, talking about Darwin. And a lot of this reminded me of a quote or a couple of quotes by Joseph Dietzken. So Dietzken was a philosopher around the time of Marx and Engels. And there's an Engels quotes on Dietzken that I think is enough to give him credibility on dialectics. And that quote is, "And this materialist dialectic, which for years has been our best working tool and our sharpest weapon, was, remarkably enough, discovered not only by us," saying Marx and Engels, "but also, independently of us, and even of Hegel, by Joseph Dietzken." And then along with that, at the First International, Marx introduced Dietzken by saying, "And here is our philosopher." So I think it's fair to say that Dietzken's portrayal of dialectics and dialectical materialism is one that Marx and Engels agreed with. And I also think Lenin, in writing Empirio-Criticism, quotes Dietzken a lot. But Dietzken's quote goes, "Is not everything a part? Is not every part a thing? Is the color of a leaf less than the thing less of a thing than that leaf itself. Color is only the sum of reactions of the leaf, light, and eye, and so is all the rest of the matter of a leaf, an aggregate of different interactions. In the same way in which our faculty of thought deprives a leaf of its color attribute and sets it apart as a thing itself, may we continue to deprive that leaf of all of its other attributes. And so doing, we finally take away everything that makes the leaf. Color is, according to its quality, no less a substance than the leaf, and the leaf is no less an attribute than its color. As the color is an attribute of the leaf, so the leaf is an attribute of the tree is an attribute of the earth an attribute of the universe. The universe is the substance in general, and all other substances are in relation to it only particular substances or attributes. But by this world substance is revealed the fact that the essence of the thing in itself, as distinguished from its manifestations, is only a concept of the mind or mental thing. So here, Deetzkin is elaborating on the idea of things, not as things, but as relations, and how individuation and trying to figure out where practical units of measurement lie, like color, are just abstract conceptions of the mind. His answer to this is that the real world is composed of an infinite number of sense-perceptible qualities whose interdependence makes them a single whole. That interdependence shows things as relations, not as things. And we can again relate that to Marx in Capital. Owen says that what's unique about Marx's ontology is his conception of reality as a totality, composed of internally related parts, and his conception of these parts as expandable, such that each one, in the fullness of its relations, can represent the totality. So, as an example, in talking about capital, it's not just the means of production. Okay, it's not just the machinery, it's not just the money laid out. It includes the whole pattern of, excuse me, it includes the whole pattern of social and economic relations that enables these means to appear and function as they do. And like capital, value isn't a thing. Like we always hear in value theory and discussion about Marx and Marxist theory, it's not a thing that we can visibly see. I think Michael Heinrich says, like, it's not a bread roll. It's not there after being produced someplace, right? It's a social relation. So coming back to Engels and coming back to the text, he's now trying to tell us what the significance of this dialectic worldview is for the outlook of the scientific socialists. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild world of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all of its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all of its apparently accidental phenomena. So we can see here that Engels is trying to demonstrate that it's through the viewpoint of dialectics that we're able to overcome the utopian ideas that, reason, justice, some absolute genius will lead us to socialism. And this passage also gives us a hint to the next section, which is going to talk about how we view history. And I think a lot of the end of the section on dialectics, which is rather short, does focus on history. He makes a point here that I think is often overlooked by Marxists who want to discuss materialism. Engels says, the perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism, but not to the simply metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. Old materialism looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees it in the process of evolution of humanity and aims at discovering the laws thereof. So I think it's important to recognize that, yes, like obviously there's a contrast between idealism and materialism, but I think that the bigger and more important distinction is the one between what Engels here is calling old materialism and modern materialism, right? Modern materialism is the standpoint of the relations between humans and how those relations drive history, what form those relations take, whether it's form of value, etc. which both idealism and old materialism abstract from. So then in closing this section, Engels leads us into the next part of the pamphlet with a short quote that says, "The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. Then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of primitive stages, was the history of class struggles, that these warring classes of society are always the products of the mode of production and of exchange. In a word, of the economic conditions of their time." Cool, and that's the second section in the pamphlet. So that's 2 out of 3 done. Does anyone have any questions, any thoughts? Have I said anything controversial yet? No? Okay, cool. It's a good sign. Okay. Oh, and of course, I don't think that I need to introduce, but this is a photograph of Marx. Yeah. So Engels starts the third and final section of the pamphlet off with a very concise quote that I think sums up a large portion of the section as a whole, or at least gives a great overview of what historical materialism is, in a way. So the quote is, "The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought, not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange." So yeah, I think it's a great quote on what historical materialism is. From this idea that the final causes of political revolutions are to be sought in the modes of production and exchange, we can see how modern scientific socialism comes in. You know, the present mode of production, capitalism, developed in freedom after the fall of feudalism, and in order to overcome that, we look towards the proletariat. So next, Engels starts describing very briefly the inception of capitalism. He talks about how after the fall of feudalism, productive forces started to grow at unheard of speeds. And with this growth, modern socialism comes in as the reflex, the ideal reflection in the minds of the class directly suffering under capitalism, aka the working class. He then describes what he calls the germ of the whole of the social antagonisms today. And he keeps coming back to this social antagonism. And that's the fact that as the capitalist mode of production, or generalized production of commodities, has grown and grown, the concentration of the means of production and of producers in large workshops and factories has followed. So from this, he starts saying that, you know, the means of production have been transformed into socialized means of production, socialized producers. So that isn't to say that, you know, the means of production are now owned socially. No, definitely not. It's still private property. They're still owned by capitalists. It's just that they're being operated socially by large groups of wage laborers. So it's this contrast of private ownership of the means of production and the socialized nature of the act of production that Engels points out as that chief social antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So this brings up the question of, you know, how did this antagonism even come about in the first place? Did everyone wake up one day, pull sticks, and then like short stick, you end up proletariat, long stick, you get to be a capitalist? Probably not. Engels describes capitalists finding wage labor ready-made for them on the market. And what was this process? Well, this is the process of primitive accumulation. This is exactly what Marx describes in Capital. One of the preconditions of capitalism is finding readily available wage labor to purchase. And it's through this original sin, this violent dispossession, this primitive accumulation, that came to be. Marx gives examples. He refers to the discovery of gold and silver in America, the enslavement of native populations, and so on. And after this happened, after the feudal wage laborer for a moment who regularly worked for his lord, but sometimes maybe sold some things, after they went from that to wage laborer for life, the social antagonism between the two classes really solidified. So after talking about this social antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, Engels talks about the effects of capitalism on social relations between people in general. He says that every society based upon the production of commodities has this aspect, that the producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his costs of production, or even to sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns in socialized production. Inherent laws of commodity production reveal themselves in the only persistent form of social interrelations. In other words, in exchange. And here, they affect the individual producers as compulsory laws of competition. They are at first unknown to these producers themselves and have to be discovered by them gradually and as the result of experience. They work themselves out, therefore, independently of the producers and in antagonism to them, as natural laws of their particular form of production. The product governs the producers. So this raises one of my favorite points of this entire section, because it's really close to the point that Marx raises in Capital, right? In producing products for exchange, the capitalist tries to optimize for socially necessary labor time, right, as best they can. And they bring their products to the market, but you can't really estimate the value. You can't really know for sure, I should say, the value that they're going to sell for, right? You don't know how much of that abstract labor time is going to be socially validated as part of the total abstract labor of society. That isn't known until this point of exchange, and that's what Engels is saying. So this forces producers to act in certain ways, right? And these ways could be, like I said, trying to reduce socially necessary labor time, trying to save on that as much as possible, or it could also be producing in certain ways. Maybe I know that one method of production is much cheaper, but worse for the environment. And I'm going to be pushed to act in that way because I'm not sure how much of the abstract labor time that I have congealed in these commodities are actually going to be validated as part of the total abstract labor of society. So this kind of vicious cycle that Engels describes, right? Like you produce your commodities, you bring them to the market, you hope that they sell, for as much as you think. This vicious cycle is related to Fourier's vicious circle and how he saw abundance of wealth becoming the source of distress and want. But Engels points out that this anarchy of production, it creates more and more proletarians. And that what Fourier wasn't able to see is that it's these masses of proletarians who will end up stopping the cycle. So next up in the section, Engels turns to the state. He talks about joint stock companies, trusts, and state ownership, as in like a bourgeois state taking ownership of companies. And he mentions that none of these are actual breaks from the capitalist mode of production. He calls the modern state the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. So while it might be defending itself against individual capitalists, it's still on the side of capitalists as a whole. He calls it essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. So if none of those are the answer, what is the answer? What is the solution to this problem? The way of transitioning past the capitalist mode of production is in what Engels says is the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing with the socialized character of the means of production. So what does this mean? Taking direct control of the means of production by society as a whole, which is not to say, again, same thing as the bourgeois state taking control of the means of production. And I also think that there's a great line in the Communist Manifesto in the preface, maybe, where Marx talks about how, as a result of the Paris Commune, the events that happened led them to revising a bunch of parts of the manifesto. And one of them is that the proletariat cannot make use of the bourgeois state, but must smash it or something like that. So Engels says that in doing this, in turning the means of production into common property, the proletariat abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinction and class antagonism, abolishes also the state as state. Society, thus far, based upon class antagonisms, has need of the state, that is, of an organization of the particular class, which was the exploiting class, an organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited classes in the condition of oppression corresponding with the given mode of production. So in that quote, he's also giving us a definition of the state as an organization of the exploiting class. So under capitalism, the bourgeoisie, middle class, the feudal lords, in ancient times, slave-owning citizens. So next up, he gives us what I think is the most famous line from this entire pamphlet. Engels describes how once the state really becomes the representative of all of society, when the means of production have been transformed into common property, the proletariat have seized power, the state renders itself unnecessary. He says, as soon as there's no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy in production are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed. And as a special repressive force, a state is no longer necessary. The state is not abolished, it dies out. And I think the more common translation is it withers away, I think is the famous quote. And I think it's important here to point out that, we know that Marx and Engels were in favor of a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And I think that's clear in how Engels phrases this paragraph. He talks about the state no longer being needed when there's no longer a class to be repressed. And he doesn't frame it as once the bourgeoisie is no longer repressing the proletariat, there's no need for a state. I think he phrases it in a way that leans itself to the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat in which the proletariat are repressing the bourgeois class. So Engels then ends the section with a recap of the task of the proletariat to gain power and the calling of scientific socialism to not only spread this message among the workers, but also to propagandize and agitate amongst them. He also gives a very brief, literal bullet point sketch of the vision of historical evolution that he's laid out, which is medieval society, capitalist revolution, proletarian revolution. So with these bullet points, I think that it's important to, guard against any sense of historical or economic determinism. I think like Larsley calls it stagism, where the idea is that Marx, Engels, Lenin, etc., prescribe to some notion that, you know, history abides by these strict stages. You got to go through A, then you got to go through B, then you got to go through C. And I think that's kind of the parodied view that's often portrayed of historical materialism. Or like the idea that, you know, it's entirely someone's economic conditions, economic relations that will decide their actions, and that is the only input. So I guess to that latter point, to that, you know, economic determinism, I would say that's really what's trying to be put across here. And I do think it's definitely not representative of actually reading through Marx and Engels' work, besides, yeah, Marx and Engels' work. The theory does imply a correlation between economic conditions and actions, obviously. But, you know, even in Lenin's time, he was arguing with other Marxists in Russia and Western Europe who prescribed to a viewpoint of economic determinism. And I think Marx has a great quote in the 18th Brumaire, where he says, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." And then on the other point that I brought up about, you know, going through stages, I think, again, reading Marx and Engels is a great antidote to believing that they thought this. In the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, in the preface, they actually wrote, "The Communist Manifesto had, as its object, the proclamation of the inevitable impending dissolution of modern bourgeois property. But in Russia, we find, face to face with the rapidly flowering capitalist swindle and bourgeois property, just beginning to develop, more than half the land owned in common by the peasants." Now, the question is, can the Russia of Obshchina, though greatly undermined, yet a form of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or on the contrary, must it first pass through the same process of dissolution, such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? The only answer to that possible today is this: if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that they both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development. So this is an excerpt written only like 10 years after Lenin's birth, right? And I think the question is asked here about whether Russia can avoid what they call the process of dissolution of ownership or property that occurred in the West, shows a good example of how the track laid out here by Engels in this work, in these bullet points, isn't a strictly predictive one, but in my opinion, better seen as an explanatory one of what we've seen in the West. And I think Larsley also, who again is the author of Lenin Rediscovered, also kind of portrays it this way when he talks about the conception of stagism between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. He writes, "Marx thinks of bourgeois revolution and socialist revolution as historical tasks imposed on the proletariat to facilitate its journey to socialism. He does not think of them as inevitable stages that every country must pass through, or as a period of calendrical time. Rather, the bourgeois democratic revolution is a way of getting things that the proletariat desperately needs, in particular, the political freedom needed to organize and enlighten." So the question that Marx and Engels raised in that preface to the Communist Manifesto is a genuine one of, can the proletariat get where they need to be, socialism, by skipping that task of bourgeois revolution? And then finally, to end this presentation and to end this pamphlet, Engels leaves us with a fantastic quote that I used for the banner for Twitter. And this is the quote: "To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism.